You stand in a room where the air feels older than the walls themselves. The light is dim, stretched thin through heavy curtains, pooling in cold patches across the floor. A stillness hangs here, not the peace of rest, but the kind that comes when life has fled and only its shadow remains. Before you lies a face, pale and unmoving. The features are carved sharp as if the bone beneath is pushing to be free. The straight nose, the strong brow, the lips pressed together in a silence no command will ever break. It is not flesh you see, but plaster, a death mask, drawn from the final impression of a man who once bent nations to his will. As you watch, the lines blur. The contours of that face dissolve, reshaping into the jagged silhouette of an island adrift in a vast and empty sea. Its cliffs rise like prison walls. Waves gnaw endlessly at the rock below, the sound carrying through the wind like a ticking clock counting down a life. This is Saint Helena. A place chosen not to kill swiftly, but to keep alive just long enough to forget the taste of freedom. Here, in a damp and decaying house, the emperor of 70 million became a captive of 7 witnesses. Some swore it was illness. Others whispered of poison, slipped in wine or food. And there are those who say it was a slower murder. Exile, isolation, and the slow erosion of a mind meant for war. You will walk the corridors of his prison. You will stand at the foot of his bed. And you will hear the details buried in the margins of history, the words of those who were there when the greatest general of an age met his end. The last roar of cannon fire at Waterloo had barely faded before the ground beneath him gave way. One moment, he was the master of the continent, the architect of empires. The next, he was a fugitive in his own world, the hunted rather than the hunter. Defeat came not in a single blow, but in the slow tightening of a net. Armies closed in. Allies vanished. Even the earth seemed to turn against him, every road a dead end, every horizon marked with the shadow of surrender. When he offered himself to the British, it was not out of trust but calculation. He believed their honor would grant him asylum, that they would allow him the dignity of living quietly in England. But the British did not see a retired general seeking peace. They saw a dangerous legend whose very existence could ignite Europe again. And so, they chose a punishment colder than execution. No prison walls, no public trial, only distance. Saint Helena. A speck in the South Atlantic, so far from the currents of civilization that even escape was a fantasy. 1,200 miles from the nearest shore, a fortress of water where the waves themselves were jailers. The voyage was a slow descent. The ship creaked and groaned as it crossed endless, empty seas. Sailors eyed him with unease, speaking in whispers as if his presence alone could summon storms. His cabin smelled of salt, damp wood, and the ink from his pen as he filled page after page with thoughts meant for no audience but himself. Day after day, the horizon remained the same, an unbroken circle of water that erased all sense of direction. By the time the jagged cliffs of St. Helena rose from the mist, it felt less like landfall and more like the mouth of a cage. If you've watched this far without hitting subscribe, you've already shown more loyalty to Napoleon than some of the men who swore to protect him. Don't betray tale of history the same way. Longwood House crouched on the windswept plateau like a damp, decaying sentinel. Its walls sweated with moisture, the ceilings bloomed with mold, and the floorboards groaned underfoot. In the corners, rats nested in shadows, darting out at night to gnaw at crumbs and clothing alike. The air was thick, stale, and heavy with the smell of rot, a place where breath felt borrowed and light seldom lingered. This was not an accident of neglect. It was part of the design. Governor Sir Hudson Lowe ensured that Napoleon's prison was not merely physical, but psychological. Every letter he wrote was read, censored, or simply never sent. Visitors were rationed like contraband. Conversations, when allowed, were watched. Even the walks outside were bound by invisible chains, timed, monitored, restricted to narrow paths where the sea was always in sight, a constant reminder of the prison that had no walls yet no exit. Lowe's rules sliced away at Napoleon's world, one liberty at a time. His companions, once loyal officers and friends, began to vanish. Some fell ill from the damp, their bodies surrendering to the island's sickness. Others were ordered away under pretexts, leaving the emperor to dine in echoing rooms, the clink of cutlery louder than the conversation. Alone, he turned to the small garden behind Longwood. Here, between the sagging fence and the coarse grass, he shaped beds of flowers and shrubs with his own hands. They became his last territory, a kingdom measured in feet, not miles. He would walk the rows slowly, touching each leaf, memorizing the scent of blossoms that could not escape. Much like their keeper, Napoleon had no choice but to spend his final years in silence. But you have a voice, the comments section is open. Use it. Or will you stay as silent as the British wanted him to be? It began as a shadow, a faint ache beneath the ribs that came and went like a warning whispered in the dark. At first, Napoleon ignored it. He had carried wounds before, sabers, bullets, frostbite, each met with the same iron endurance. But this was different. The pain did not fade. It deepened, curling around his stomach like a tightening fist. The days grew heavier. Fatigue settled into his limbs until climbing the steps of Longwood felt like marching through mud. By the turn of the year, his legs began to swell, leaving him shuffling from chair to bed as if the ground itself resisted his movement. His once dark hair thinned and fell in brittle strands. The color drained from his face, replaced by a sickly yellow cast that gave him the look of a man already claimed by the grave. In the long nights, the pain sharpened into certainty. In conversations with his faithful Bertrand, Napoleon confided a suspicion that had taken root: he was being poisoned. Slowly, deliberately. He spoke of bitter tastes in his drinks, of subtle changes in his meals, of the way his health declined even on days when the weather was kind. Bertrand recorded these words, preserving the paranoia, or perhaps the truth, for posterity. The doctor's reports did not speak in unison. Francesco Antimarchi, the Corsican physician who stood closest to him in those final months, described a stomach riddled with disease, lesions that suggested a natural and terminal illness. But the British medical records told a cleaner story, less detail, fewer irregularities, an account that smoothed over what might trouble the conscience. The gaps between these testimonies were as telling as the words themselves. You're still here. You care about history. So why watch without subscribing? History forgets those who stay silent, don't let the same be said of you. The official story leaned toward the familiar enemy, stomach cancer. It was, after all, a disease that had claimed others in his bloodline. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, had wasted away with similar pains. The swelling, the jaundiced skin, the relentless gnawing beneath the ribs, all fit the pattern. British officials clung to this explanation, presenting it as the quiet, inevitable end of a mortal man. But science, centuries later, would dig into his grave and stir the ashes of doubt. In the 1960s, tests on strands of Napoleon's preserved hair revealed abnormal levels of arsenic, a poison as silent as the damp wind off the Atlantic. Some suggested it was deliberate, delivered in minuscule doses that would mimic natural illness while ensuring no recovery. Others argued the source was more insidious: the green pigment of Longwood's wallpaper, rich in arsenic compounds that leached into the air in the constant humidity, turning his prison into a slow chamber of death. There was another suspect lurking in the shadows: the house itself. The damp structure of Longwood was a cradle for mold, its spores riding the stagnant air into his lungs, feeding infections that his weakening body could no longer repel. Even without a human hand guiding the blade, the building was killing him in ways no doctor could reverse. And yet, perhaps the deadliest force of all needed no toxin, no fungus, no pigment. Isolation gnawed deeper than any disease. Years of confinement stripped away purpose, eroded the will to fight, and pressed the weight of defeat into his very bones. The mind and body are bound by invisible threads, snap enough of them, and the body follows. Historians remain divided. Some insist the autopsy leaves no room for doubt: stomach cancer, pure and simple. Others see the irregularities, the silences in official accounts, and find only suspicion. The truth may still lie buried with him, beneath 6 feet of Saint Helena soil. I want to know your verdict. Was Napoleon murdered, or doomed by fate? Drop it in the comments. Or scroll past like one of the guards who looked away. The dawn came reluctantly. On that last morning, the light did not so much enter the room as creep in, filtered through the heavy shutters, reduced to a thin, gray ribbon that fell across the damp floorboards. Outside, the Atlantic wind was restless, carrying with it the smell of salt and the hiss of waves clawing at the rocky shore. Napoleon's body was already failing him. The fever had deepened overnight. Every breath he drew was shallow, uneven, like a man pulling air from the bottom of a well. Sweat pooled at his temples, dampening the hair that still clung stubbornly to its dark color. His skin, once animated by force and will, was now a map of exhaustion, pale, waxen, and cold in places where the blood no longer cared to circulate. Around the bed, there was no ceremony. Only the unspoken knowledge that the emperor's hours were numbered. Montholon, ever the loyal shadow, stood close enough to hear the faint rasp of air in and out. Bertrand watched from a step back, his arms stiff at his sides, his jaw tight as if any word might betray weakness. And there was Marchand, the valet who had seen him at his most unguarded, carefully adjusting the damp cloth on Napoleon's forehead, moving with the reverence one might show to a relic rather than a man. By mid-morning, the fever was no longer just in his skin. It was in his mind. His eyes would fix on the ceiling, and then drift toward the far corner of the room as though something stood there waiting for him, something only he could see. At times his lips moved without sound, rehearsing conversations from decades ago, issuing orders to armies that no longer existed. And then, for a moment, clarity returned. His gaze sharpened, and his breathing steadied enough to form words. They came slowly, shaped with effort, each syllable the weight of a lifetime. France, the army. Josephine. 3 fragments. 1 a nation. 1 the weapon by which he had bent the world. 1 the woman who had once been his whole world. After that, the fever took the rest. His hands, which had signed the fate of kingdoms, now lay open, palms turned upward, as though ready to surrender them. The hours shrank. Shadows lengthened along the floor. The rhythm of his breathing broke into uneven pauses, and each pause lingered just long enough for the men by his bed to think it was over. But each time, the chest would rise again, drawing in one more fragile thread of air. At 5:49 p.m., it stopped. No gasp. No cry. Just stillness. Montholon's head lowered first. Bertrand's shoulders trembled in a way he would later deny. Marchand, with the quiet skill of a man who had always been invisible in great moments, reached out and closed the emperor's eyes. The room did not move. The only sound was the ocean beyond the walls, slow, deliberate waves grinding against stone, as if the island itself knew what it had taken. Some say there was a smell of violets in the air that evening. Others say it was only the sea wind. But all agreed on one thing: something immense had left the room. His body remained, but the force that had once crossed Europe like a storm, was gone. They kept his body in that room for 2 days. The air grew heavy, and the damp salt from the sea seemed to cling to the sheets, the clothes, even the walls themselves. The British officers filed in, one by one, their faces an unreadable blend of duty and discomfort, some out of respect, some out of morbid curiosity. When the time came, there was no imperial procession, no marble vault prepared in Paris. Instead, the man who had crowned himself Emperor of the French was carried out under the grey sky of Saint Helena, his coffin borne not by generals of state, but by the few loyal men the British still allowed near him. The burial site lay in a hollow valley, guarded by a cluster of willows whose branches swayed like mourners' arms in the Atlantic wind. The ground was damp, the grass thick. The sea was not visible from here, only the endless cliffs rising above. There, in that isolation, they lowered him into the earth. By order of the British governor, there would be no name carved into the stone. Only a simple slab above the soil, as though it could hide from history whose remains lay beneath. The willows whispered in the wind, but the rest of the island was silent. His tomb bore no Napoleon. No emperor. Only anonymity, as if they could erase him with blank granite. And yet, he was not forgotten. 19 years later, in 1840, Paris demanded him back. The French king, eager to win the people's favor, sent a ship across the Atlantic, the Belle Poule, to bring home the man who had once ruled their destiny. The exhumation was carried out in the same valley where they had buried him. When they opened the coffin, the witnesses swore his face had not decayed, that he lay there as if merely asleep, the laurel wreath still resting above his brow. The sea wind was sharp that day, but the crowd that had gathered in Paris to receive him did not care. As the funeral procession wound its way through the streets toward the Hôtel des Invalides, thousands wept openly. Men removed their hats. Women clutched handkerchiefs to their lips. Children were hoisted on shoulders to see the coffin draped in imperial colors. In death, he was larger than in life. Across Europe, even among those who had once cursed his name, the image of Napoleon shifted. He was no longer simply the conqueror, the exile, the tyrant. He had become the prisoner of an unforgiving island, the victim of fate, perhaps even of enemies who had feared him too much to let him live. And today, his death is still a wound that refuses to heal. Historians quarrel over the details, scientists scrape at strands of his hair, and writers search for meaning in his final words. But like the ocean around Saint Helena, the truth remains deep, restless, and impossible to silence. Napoleon's name lived on because people kept telling his story. If you don't subscribe, you silence tale of history's voice, and maybe the next great story dies with it. The air in the chamber had grown still. Not the stillness of peace, but the stillness of something that has stopped breathing. In the end, the man who once bent maps to his will, could not even lift a cup of water to his own lips. His voice, the one that commanded armies, silenced courts, and redrew kingdoms, dwindled to a whisper. He had built his life like a fortress. Every stone, every victory, stacked higher, thicker, impenetrable. But fortresses, history reminds us, are not only broken by siege engines. Sometimes, they rot from the inside. We will never know if it was the slow, invisible hand of sickness that claimed him, or the sharper, swifter hand of another, someone who smiled in his presence, bowed in his court, and stirred something deadly into his wine. The records contradict each other. Some scribes wrote of fevers and delirium. Others, the ones whose writings were buried in the margins of manuscripts, dared to suggest darker truths. The only certainty is that his death did not echo like a triumph, it sank like a stone in deep water, unseen, unheard, and soon forgotten. And perhaps that is the cruelest ending of all. Not betrayal. Not murder. Not disease. But silence. A silence so complete that the man who once shaped continents could vanish into the folds of history, reduced to a date in a chronicle, a statue with a chipped nose, and a name most will never pronounce correctly. So we are left with the question I asked you at the very start, did he die of illness, or was he helped into the grave? I cannot answer it for you. History rarely gives the satisfaction of certainty. It prefers the company of shadows. But I will tell you this. His story is not the only one to end this way. There are others. Rulers. Queens. Generals. Each wearing the same crown of power, and the same invisible mark on their backs. The next of those stories is waiting for you. Right here. Right now. Another ruler. Another death. Another silence, because if you leave now, this silence will claim more than just his memory. It will claim your curiosity. And I've given you 15 minutes of his life. If you cannot give Tale of History 1 second of yours to subscribe, tell me, was it all for nothing?